quickly introduce our speaker today, who is Karlo Doroc. He's visiting us from what is quickly becoming our sister school, the Center for Brain, Mind, and Markets. There's a lot of overlap between the types of methods and research questions, so I'm sure you'll find this talk interesting. Also, Karlo's coming from an award-winning presentation at the Australasian Mathpsych conference in Singapore, so we've got a lot to look forward to. Thanks, Dan. Hey everyone, so I'll be presenting on the 3 studies in my PhD, where I focused on cognitive resources and complex decisions, or perhaps more accurately, how Indiana Jones can tie together cognitive resources and complex decisions. So our roadmap today is starting with some motivation and focusing in on decision difficulty and its interaction with cognitive capacities in terms of affecting decision making. In study 1, we looked at variations in cognitive capacities brought about via acute stress. Then in study 2, we looked at chronic stress, and in study 3, healthy cognitive aging. And then we'll wrap up with some discussion and hopefully a more nuanced view of how these things interact to affect our choices. So the guiding quote for today is one by Herbert Simon: "Rational behavior is shaped by a scissors whose 2 blades are the structure of task environments and the computational capabilities of the actor." And so we're going to break down each of these 2 blades and then hopefully bring them together in each of these 3 studies. So we'll start with the structure of task environments. And one way that we can operationalize at least an aspect of this is the inherent difficulty or complexity of a particular task. And the main idea here is the more complex the task, the lower the quality of our decisions. And so we can leverage computational complexity theory, or CCT, to study the computational resources, that is, time and memory, needed to solve a computational problem, something that we can solve with an algorithm or a clear step-by-step approach. And CCT as a framework is very abstract and general. So it applies to anything that performs computation, possibly even including human decision making. And in the last few years in our lab, we've developed several metrics inspired by CCT that can measure decision difficulty as the average number of computational resources needed to decide correctly. And so we'll be leveraging those metrics in each of these studies. So our overarching assumption is that people are taking in information, they're processing that information in some way, and then making their decision. Or in the language of computation theory, there's an input, computation is performed on that input, and that's what determines the output. To be clear, we're not saying the brain is an iMac or a laptop, but rather just that we both perform this abstract input, compute something, and deliver an output. All right, then on the other side, the capabilities of the actor, you don't need me to tell you that as people we have binding resource constraints, so things like working memory, information processing capacity, the capacity for attention, etc., are all constrained in some way. And cognitive capacities can vary both within and between people due to several factors, including but not limited to things like stress, age, sleep, and mental illness, just to name a few. So I told you at the start that Indiana Jones is our hero today, and Indiana Jones is stressed. Indiana Jones is getting old. So those are going to be our focuses today. So focusing on those, with acute stress, several aspects of basic cognition are affected. We have negative effects on things like working memory or planning, but we can have positive effects in other domains, like our inhibition or ability to learn from negative feedback. In contrast, chronic stress only has negative correlates. So things like working memory and set shifting, for instance, have been shown to deteriorate. Finally, with age, we get this inverted U-shape for cognitive ability over the lifespan, where our fluid abilities like working memory tend to decline from early adulthood, as I can already begin to attest to, whereas our crystallized abilities peak much later in life, in our 50s. So I would argue that it's unclear how these resource constraints affect our decision-making capacity, in the sense that many of the paradigms that study these types of cognitive capacities are focusing on relatively simple and basic tasks of executive functioning or perceptual decision-making. And so it's not clear to me whether this would necessarily generalize to the level of higher order reasoning or decision-making, where perhaps deficits in some areas can be compensated for in other areas, or we might be able to adapt our strategy to cope with any deficits. Of the work that does focus on decision-making directly, many tend to employ probabilistic paradigms like bandit or risky tasks, where it can be hard to disentangle the effects of preferences from the capacity to decide correctly. So to illustrate this, suppose that we observe higher risk-taking under stress. It's not immediately clear, is this because now my preference for risk has increased that I'm stressed? Or is it my capacity to ascertain how much risk I'm taking that's changed? In which case, if, for example, that's been systematically depleted, I might be taking more risk than I actually would want to. Finally, we know moderators matter a lot. And so what about complexity or computational demands as one important potential moderator here? So we're going to turn to trusty Indiana Jones to help us fill each of these gaps with his knapsack problem. So imagine you're Indiana, you've charged into some lair and there's all this beautiful treasure on display and you want to take out the most valuable pieces, but you can only escape with whatever fits inside your knapsack. So this is essentially the problem that we put to each of our participants. So they saw something like this, where we have the constraint or the capacity of their backpack, and then a set of items that each has a dollar value and a weight. And so this knapsack problem has a number of useful properties, including it's broadly applicable, so these weights and values can model things from attention allocation to scheduling decisions through to consumer choices or economic choices. It's also an objective and non-probabilistic setting, so we can hopefully measure our decision-making capacity separately from preferences for risk, for instance. But there is still an element of uncertainty here, perhaps an underexplored element, which we're calling epistemic uncertainty, in that even when you arrive at the right solution, it can be very difficult for you to know that that solution is indeed the right one. It's clearly complex and higher order, drawing on multiple cognitive processes, and the combinatorics here mean that even with small sets of items, the number of possible combinations can quickly explode. Finally, we can compute precise and general measures of decision difficulty here. So by precise, I mean that we can accurately predict how people will perform, and general in two senses. Firstly, the measures we're using are independent of the knapsack task. You can use those same measures in other computational problems. And secondly, they don't depend on the particular strategy or algorithm people are using. And given the huge heterogeneity in solving strategies that we see both within and across individuals, being able to sort of account or capture that is important. All right, so in study one, we had a within participants design in the lab where we induced acute stress and then had them solve these tasks and had some eye tracking measures. Study two was online on Prolific, so much larger sample, and they did the knapsack as well as a cognitive task battery. Study three, basically the same design as study two, so online and with a suite of tasks. So our main questions here, firstly, do stress and age affect decision-making? Secondly, what about the difficulty of the decisions? And then finally, combining those two blades of the scissors, how do they jointly affect decision-making? So starting with study one and acute stress. So it was, people came in twice, so they would come in one day, either have the acute or the placebo control session, and then they would come back roughly a week later and do the complement, perfectly counterbalanced across people. In terms of the stimuli or the trials that we designed, we had a 2x2 design, so we had complex or difficult, computationally demanding decisions where we expected people would get about 70% accuracy, and then easier decisions where we expected about 90% accuracy. Further, this was the decision version of the problem. I'll explain a bit more about that in a second, but it means every answer was binary, either yes or no. So this is what it looks like. We see a very similar trial setup to before, but we have this added constraint in the middle with the dollars. So the question is there at least one set of items here that meets both constraints, that achieves the minimum amount of dollars, but does not exceed the maximum allowance of weight? So imagine you're hiring a thief. You want them to go see if they'll go and steal something for you, but it's only worth their while if they can get $158, otherwise they're not going to bother, right? So to illustrate a little bit the intuition of the, so each trial had 8 items. To illustrate a bit the intuition of what do we mean by easier or harder or more or less computationally demanding, consider these few examples. Suppose I asked, is there at least one set of items that gets us $30 of value? What would you answer? Yes, right? Easy. What if I said, can you get $700? Another easy case, but this time it's a no, right? Or if we set that somewhere in the middle, suddenly it's not so easy. We've got to do a lot of computations to try and combinations to try and figure it out. And in this case, 165 turns out to be the most you could possibly get. So the best performing set would get you 165. So that would be as hard an example as it gets. In terms of time, so people came in, went through some instructions, they underwent a rest and then the stress or the placebo intervention, and then they did the knapsack task for about an hour. Throughout the study, we have measures of salivary cortisol, that's our main measure of stress. We also have negative affect, some electrodermal activity during the intervention, and then gaze tracking data throughout the knapsack. So how did we stress people? We used the TRIA social stress test. So for those that aren't familiar, in the control session, it was nice and simple. They come in, we say, you have to give a speech about your hobbies. You've got 5 minutes to prepare your speech. Then they go into another room and they deliver that speech to an empty room. So I'm not even in there, I've left. They're just by themselves talking out loud for 5 minutes about their hobbies. And then they do another similarly banal counting task, just 15, 30, 45, and see how far you can get in 5 minutes. In the stress version, they are pitching for their dream job. Then at the end of writing down their speech, we strip their notes from them without telling them that that would happen, and they have to deliver that speech to 2 confederates who are giving no verbal or non-verbal feedback, so no smiles, no nods. If the person stops, 30 seconds of awkward silence is allowed to ensue. And finally, they have to serially subtract 17 from 2047, and every time they make a mistake, they start all over again. So as you can imagine, people found this quite stressful. So we see that after the intervention, cortisol levels shoot up, so the red here in stress, and they stay higher for the rest of the session, for a full hour or so. Negative affect jumps up immediately after the intervention, stays high for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then drops back to baseline. Looking at some of the other physiological measures, we see immediately after the intervention, pupil size widens for the stress condition relative to control, and then returns to baseline by the second block, which is maybe 10 minutes or so in. We didn't see any difference with our EVA or skin conductance data, but we had some issues with data quality there and had to drop a lot, so potentially underpowered there. Yeah.
What did you tell them about why you were doing this to them? I mean, like, did they have a reason, especially the ones like as a multiple session, did they have did they know you were trying to stress them, or was it? Yeah.
So we didn't advertise it as a stress study, but we said we were looking at emotional and physiological reactions to a performance and decision-making tasks. So this was the performance task. Yeah. All right, looking at behavior then. So here we have some regression coefficients plotted, and this is only, what I'm showing here is only the cortisol responders. So the subset of people who saw a significant jump in their cortisol levels. So we can see that the hardness metrics worked. So this big negative effect in red is our accuracy regression. So the quality of their decisions was much lower. The green and blue here are measures of the time that they spent. So on the harder trials, they were less accurate and they took more time. Our main measure of cortisol was area under the cortisol curve, or increase with respect to the cortisol curve. We see the same pattern in terms of our accuracy is getting worse and our time is getting longer, but the effects are minuscule in comparison to the effects of the hardness manipulation. We also see no interaction with hardness. So among cortisol responders, nothing to see. We were expecting to see a negative interaction here, where we thought the biggest gap should occur precisely where you're already perhaps struggling, where you're already constrained. We did see that negative interaction we expected when we considered the full sample, so both responders and non-responders included. Diving a little deeper into where performance broke down, we split on two dimensions. Firstly, what was the true answer? So in this case, satisfiable means the true answer is yes, there is some combination of items that meets the constraints, or unsatisfiable is there is no combination that meets the constraints. And then at the bottom, on the x-axis, we have whether or not they used all of the available time. So they had 40 seconds per trial. They could submit early if they wanted, or they could use the full 40 seconds before they answered. And so we see that if they didn't use the maximum time, there's no significant difference between stress and control when the true answer was yes. But when they did use the maximum time, we see this massive drop in performance to near chance levels, right? If you're performing at chance, you're still hitting 50% here. So when they're running out of time, they're guessing no more often under stress than under the control condition. And we see that same pattern in the unsatisfiable trials. So here, the stress group is performing slightly worse in relative terms when they don't use all the time available. But when they do use all the time available, there's no difference. So that's again consistent with responding no more often under stress and time pressure. And in terms of gaze, the main difference we saw was again under time pressure. So when they used most of the max time, the stress group had shorter dwell times on our areas of interest. So our items or the constraints in the middle. So they were sort of, it's hinting here that they're perhaps a little more scattered in their attention. So the main takeaway then was that stress's impairing effect was greatest under time pressure. And we saw, in fact, that if we exclude all trials where they use the maximum time, there was no effect of stress at all. So wrapping up, yes, time pressure is potentially a key moderator. We saw this increasing of no responses with stress and time pressure, so perhaps we're seeing some increased pessimism here, and some tentative evidence for a shift in attention allocation. We didn't see the expected interaction between decision difficulty and stress among the cortisol responders, but we did among the full sample. So some possible explanations, perhaps we were underpowered when looking at the cortisol responders, or perhaps stress is affecting some cognitive resource that is independent of decision difficulty or the resource requirements of the task itself. Next, we tackled chronic stress. So this time we have an online study with about 350 people recruited from Prolific. This sample was broadly representative of US adults aged 18 to 65 in terms of age, sex, and ethnicity. About a 1.5 hour study, roughly an hour on instructions and the knapsack, 20 minutes looking at a cognitive task battery, and then some self-reports. Our main measure of perceived chronic stress was we administered 3 separate chronic stress related questionnaires, and then we aggregated the sum scores of those into a common factor, so that we just had a single numerical score for each person. Now for studies 2 and 3, we use the optimization variant of the knapsack. So now we're back to just a single constraint, the weight capacity, and it's no longer a binary answer, but rather you have to click on the items that you think make up the best possible set, the set that gets you the highest value. And these types of optimization problems are a bit like climbing a mountain, right? So you start off with a relatively crappy solution that's not worth much value, you find something better, but ultimately what you're looking for is that global optimum, that solution that gets you the highest possible value. And depending on the structure or the geometry of the particular trial, sometimes that peak might be easy to find, right? All paths lead in the same direction. But sometimes it's not. You might have several local optima, and it's not clear which one of these is actually best. Or perhaps, like Indiana Jones here, you've scaled a peak, but you have to see, can you look through the clouds and determine, is there a higher peak somewhere else, or is this as good as it gets? So this is getting at that epistemic uncertainty from earlier. So our measures of chronic stress, we had the perceived stress scale, the Trier inventory of chronic stress, and the perceived stress questionnaire. And then they did about 30 trials of the knapsack. They rated their confidence after each trial. And then in terms of the cognitive task battery, I won't go through the tasks in detail, but we had 1 measure each for working memory, set shifting, and motor inhibition, so the sort of classic executive functioning domains, and then processing speed / attention, and fluid reasoning with some progressive matrices. The self-report measures that we administered were mostly constructs that we expected to be related to chronic stress. So we had the DAS to measure depression, state anxiety. We also, we had a trait anxiety measure, neuroticism, fatigue, etc. So what did we find? Our measure of perceived chronic stress, or PCS, did seem to pick something up. So as you would expect, it was positively correlated with each of those related constructs we were just discussing in terms of depression, anxiety, fatigue, etc. But when we ran our structural equation models here, we saw no real effect of having higher perceived chronic stress, either on the knapsack task or on any of these sort of mediating more basic cognitive tasks. So the gray here are credible intervals containing 0, so sort of non-significant results. And so we can see that sort of those more basic functions, having a better memory, having faster processing speed, this helps in doing the knapsack in our measure of decision making, but chronic stress doesn't seem to be related to many of them. We just have this fairly small positive effect on processing speed, just in this super simple model. When we add in demographic controls, we see that even for the processing measure, we get a null effect, essentially. So for each task, no significant effect of stress. When we focus in just on the knapsack and trying to predict sort of trial by trial accuracy, we do find 3 subgroups where the negative effect is slightly larger, but it's still not credible, right? And this is sort of post hoc and underpowered, so take with a healthy dose of salt, but maybe there's something happening there. So what did we learn from this study? Our measure of PCS or stress did seem valid. It seemed to be picking something up, yet we found basically no effect of it on decision making or any of the other cognitive tasks. Using Bayesian stats, the evidence in favor of the null was 5.7, so sort of moderate evidence. I didn't show this, but in exploratory analyses, we tried to look at how people explored the search space, what types of mistakes they made, their metacognition in terms of the confidence ratings. Again, basically no relation to our chronic stress measure. And we had those 3 subgroups where perhaps there's something. So our young cohort, our tertiary educated cohort, and those who were below average in the processing speed task. So some possible explanations for this null is that maybe age and education matter more than we previously thought. So most studies that have established the negative effect of perceived chronic stress focus either on university students as their main sample, so that would hit both our young and educated group, or on over 65s where their cognition is perhaps starting to drop off anyway. I've only seen two sort of well-powered null results, and they both happen to use predominantly middle-aged samples, just like our one was. So maybe there's something there. Perhaps chronic stress only has a negative effect in extreme cases, rather than the relatively normal distribution that we observe here. So the distribution of scores that we get is very similar to that reported in validating studies for the respective instruments. We don't have evidence for this in our data. The most extreme high stress people didn't seem that different from the rest. Or maybe the true effect is simply small. So I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on that afterwards. And finally, we turn to study 3 and healthy aging. So the design here was basically the same as in the previous study, just now our prolific participants, half of them are aged 18 to 30 and half of them are aged over 65. But other than that, they're doing exactly the same tasks, and we just have some slight differences in the self-reports. So instead of things like depression and anxiety, now we're measuring things that we expect to be more related to age, like motivation, affect, life priorities, and so on. So we did this for the previous study as well, but it wasn't as relevant there. So we aggregated the 5 sort of cognitive tasks into a single latent factor, which I'm going to call the cognition index for ease of reference. More on that shortly. In terms of performance, so here we have the correlation between age group, either young versus old, and performance on each task. And we can see credible negative effects ranging from about -0.2 through to about -0.7, depending on the task. But the older group were doing worse in every task, including the cognition index. Turning to our knapsack task, our main measure of decision making, we see that the older group here in red was in fact doing worse than our younger group in blue. So their decision quality was lower, both on the easier and the harder cases, despite taking more time. So again, in both easy and hard, our older group were taking much more time than our younger group. And as before, we had come into this expecting to see that the biggest gap between groups would be on the harder cases, where they're already constrained. What we find is the opposite. So the biggest gap was actually in the easier cases. So we see about, in terms of accuracy, for instance, about a 15% gap in easy, but only a 10-point gap in hard, and that difference was credible. We see the same pattern with decision time as well. Digging a little deeper, we saw that our effects were driven predominantly by that cognition index and not by age per se. So we see our old distribution here is sort of shifted to the left relative to our younger group. There is still a lot of overlap between them though. And when we compare our cognition index on the x-axis and our knapsack performance on the y-axis, we get basically the same slope for both age groups. This is reinforced with our structural equation modeling, where we see no direct effect of age group on knapsack performance. So we have that big gray line down the middle, but we get these quite strong negative indirect effects via the basic cognitive tasks. So our older group have lower processing speed, worse working memories, etc., and these are important for the knapsack. One protective factor was our older group spent more time, and that did help with their performance. Note, whenever we threw any other demographics or self-reports in here, none of them could predict performance. So motivation, affect, life priorities, education, nothing seemed to matter much, health, etc. That surprising to us interaction effect, that positive interaction where the gap was smallest on the easier trials, we replicate that when we replace age as our bins with whether they were below or above the median for the cognition index. So if you recall, there was quite a lot of overlap between the distributions, but the effects only get stronger, where our below median cognition group has lower accuracy, and that gap is largest in the easier cases. We actually saw this exact pattern in the chronic stress study as well. So the effect sizes were smaller, but the direction was the same. In terms of exploration, our older group clicked around less often. And there were a couple of differences that emerged in the types of mistakes that occurred. So our older group were more likely to reach a local optima and then simply stop there. So they wouldn't backtrack, they wouldn't click any further. So that would be consistent with sort of reaching that peak and not being able to see through the clouds that there was a higher peak somewhere else. But the surprising one for us was these spare capacity errors, which I'm calling relatively simple mistakes. These are cases where they didn't even reach a local peak. They could have added an item for free. They had the capacity for an item, but they didn't do so. And importantly, it's not the case that they were simply running out of time. So on average, they had 90 seconds per trial. We see that about 60 seconds in, they do their last click on average. They spend about 10 to 15 seconds just looking at the screen. So implying that perhaps they're just trying to check, can I do better than what I currently have? Or have I met the constraints with this combination? And then they submit their answer with still about 15 to 20 seconds on the clock on average. So they do still have ample time to make further changes if they wish. And then the last finding I'll show you is one related to metacognition. So here we have a similar sort of structural equation model to before. We've added this metacognition index in the middle here. So this is just aggregating two measures of metacognition. One is what's the difference between their mean performance and their mean confidence when they're on the same scale. So perfect performance here would be there's no difference, right? My confidence is perfectly calibrated to how well I actually do. And the other measure in that index is what is my confidence when I get it right minus my confidence when I get it wrong. How well can I discriminate right and wrong answers based on confidence judgments? So we see that this metacognition index has a very strong positive effect on performance. Part of that is confounded because the measures have performance in them. But nevertheless, I think this hints at some interesting questions in that perhaps our cognitive abilities are helping us to climb the peak, but our metacognitive abilities are helping us to look through the clouds. And so I'd be interested in seeing if there's a way that we can at least partially disentangle those two concepts. So what did we learn here? Our older adults had lower quality decision-making, particularly on easier trials. They were less likely to reach the optimum, which was our main measure of performance. But if we look at distance from the optimum, they were also further away there, both in terms of the number of dollars that they were away from the best value, and in terms of the number of items that were distant between their set and the correct set. This was predominantly driven by our lower scores of basic cognition and not age, education, motivation, etc. So one implication here is that perhaps age-based cutoffs, like mandatory retirement ages, for instance, should be challenged, and it should be abilities that matter. more importantly, Indiana Jones should be just fine. His cognition still seems pretty intact to me. We also saw lower click-based exploration from our old group, more of those simple mistakes, and a higher degree of overconfidence. So, wrapping things up and bringing it all together, across all three studies, we saw that our measures of decision difficulty strongly predicted performance. And so a couple of contributions here was that these measures are more generalizable and principled than many out there in the literature. And relative to the prior work in our lab, we've replicated these in much more diverse and much larger samples than previously. The other blade of our scissors, we saw that stress and aging were associated, or acute stress and aging were associated with reduced performance, but no effect of perceived chronic stress. So a couple of contributions here. We have a bit more nuance, where acute stress only seemed to matter under time pressure, and with age, it wasn't the number that mattered, but rather the basic cognitive abilities that mattered. On the perceived chronic stress side, perhaps those subgroups are hinting that age and education matter more than we previously thought. And we're also, this is the first time that we have direct evidence of the knapsack being related to more basic levels of cognition. Looking at the interaction and bringing those two scissors together, in all three studies, the interaction between decision difficulty and some measure of cognitive capacities was significant, but the pattern was mixed between them. So with acute stress, we saw the negative interaction we expected among the full sample, but not among cortisol responders, whilst in the other two studies, we saw the positive interaction that we weren't expecting, where the biggest gap was on those easier trials. So this perhaps suggests that there could be a nonlinear relationship between the decision maker versus task resource gap on one axis and performance on the other. So here's one example illustration of that, where, say if you're a young adult and your performance is good and we make things harder, then there's going to be a big drop-off. Whereas if that resource gap is already quite wide, then the drop-off will be lower. This is also broadly consistent with a meta-analysis in diffusion parameters that found the difference between young and old also got relatively smaller as the difficulty of the task increased. So I'd be interested if anyone has any thoughts on why that might be the case. The meta-analysis just reported what they found. They didn't have any ideas on why that might be happening. So with that, I would like to thank my co-authors. There's some QR codes there if you want to check out the papers. So the acute stress paper is out in Communication Psychology. The other two are preprints, so very open to feedback. A few outstanding questions. Why didn't we find any effect of chronic stress? How can we explain the negative interaction, if it exists on the acute stress side, with the positive interaction in the other two studies? And a few potential areas for collaboration. Can we model how people are solving this problem? Can we explore epistemic uncertainty a bit more, where it's hard to tell if you've got something right? And can we partially disentangle these roles of cognition and metacognition in these kinds of combinatorial problems? So open to other ideas as well, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Karlo, you've delivered a high-quality talk in a shorter capacity time slot with a minimum of stress. So we have plenty of time for questions.
Yeah.
So for the first study, could it be possible that, adults, the older people, how they perceive the task, how, like, they two thoughts, the task is quite difficult. Younger people are like trying to solve the problem, like they are playing games, and the older people are like, whatever.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, the only two things we can point to here is that, firstly, on the incentive side, they're only paid if they get the exact optimal answer. If they get close, but not quite there, that trial won't be rewarded for them. And
it's
then-
not older people a bit more rich than the younger people.
Yeah,
you know,
that's true.
I don't need like how many dollars, like $50 a year, that kind of thing. Could that be a case?
Possible, yeah. Like we can't answer that with our data. And then the second point is on the motivation side, the older group did report higher levels of motivation initially, which was contrary to what we expected. And they spent more time, so they did seem to be genuinely engaging and trying the task. But certainly we saw, so the way it was set up, they had the sort of reasonably detailed instructions at the start before they progress, and many more older people dropped out in the instruction stage and didn't go on to complete the study. So that gives us a bit more confidence that those that did it were sort of reasonably serious about it. But we can't rule out differences in sort of the extent to which they're happy to just settle for what they've got versus really pushing for the best possible answer. Yeah.
One thing that I thought was potentially interesting as to why you might not get a chronic stress effect, but also like wondering your thoughts, because I don't know much about stress and the literature on that. But your stress induction manipulation in the first experiment, particularly the counting part, but also just doing a speech without memory, feels like you could also interpret it as just a challenging cognitive task that might have taken some amount of your cognitive resources, like it's just tired you out a bit. Do you think it's possible that that type of stress maybe could be conceptualized as, that manipulation could be conceptualized in other ways that might not be stress as the thing that caused the change of behavior, and that maybe chronic stress is a different kind of stress that doesn't have that whatever?
So yeah, good question. So a lot of the theory around chronic stress is that it is depleting your resources in some way as well, right? So that there's maybe some part of your brain that's constantly worrying or focusing on this stressor and distracting you from being able to do whatever it is that you want to do. But certainly the nature is very different between the acute and the chronic side. And to get at your first point of, is it just because of the, like, this is a challenging task sort of thing, the nature of the placebo intervention in the first case is to try and replicate the fact that you're still having to speak and still having to do arithmetic, and hopefully just isolate the stressful components rather than the physical components, if that makes sense. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question exactly, but yeah. Dan?
I have a kind of related question, which is, it's in the weeds a little bit, but kind of the decision to analyse just cortisol responses in study one. On the one hand, I know that's totally consistent with the way people generally do that in this sort of stress literature. On the other hand, it sort of amounts to kind of conditioning on a post-treatment variable, which in the sort of longitudinal causal analysis kind of literature is frowned upon. You know, if you have a randomized control trial and you condition on something that happened after the randomization, technically you break the effect of the randomization. And I was just wondering if you could comment on what the results look like with versus without the number of people as well.
So we had 41 participants that we didn't, like one was an outlier and got excluded, so then we had 41 left. Of those 41, 27 were responders and the rest weren't. And then we reported, we basically did the full analysis on both sets. So in the main paper, we focus on the responders, and then in the supplementary, we have the complementary results for the full group. The differences were pretty minimal between the two.
There's some interaction that was significant in the full sample, wasn't it?
So that was the main difference between them. So in the full sample, we had that the only deterioration that occurred was on the harder instances, whereas in the responder sample, the difficulty of the instances didn't matter. It was a relatively uniform depreciation across the two. Yeah.
Did did the tendency to respond to the stress induction correlate with any other sort of demographic variables of interest? Is it certain people who are responding to the physiological
We don't really have enough power to detect that kind of effect. So there was no huge difference among sex, and there wasn't much variation in age, and those are the only other two demographics we had.
So I think this is really interesting. I was just thinking about the nature of the knapsack task, which has all the advantages you suggested. But one thing is it's a timed task, right? And so, which on one hand is a lot of actual problems and stuff are, but I wondered if, like, what would you expect to see if it was a similar kind of task in terms of the epistemic uncertainty and the juggling among multiple things, but like you were given, you know, days or whatever, like, because like the real world has loads of these. What job do I take? What do I blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And at least the anecdotal thing in the real world is that older people are better at those, well, as an older person, you know, like, you know, at least have more wisdom, and younger people are sort of more impulsive or whatever. And so I was wondering if, but that's just the anecdote, like, this is a long-winded way of asking, what do you expect of your findings are because it was a fairly time-pressured task, and that's where these cognitive resources really matter, and we know older people are slow, and yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have a satisfying answer for you, but it's something we're interested in looking at a bit more, like playing around with time and potentially giving them untimed instances versus timed to see, is the pattern of behavior much different? Like, are people really willing to search for super long periods, or do they just drop off more? So yeah, I don't have an answer, but I agree it's an interesting thing to look into.
There's some questions from Yuval's on the chat, so maybe I'll ask you the third one. It's, why do you predict metacognition decision time and not the reverse?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I don't remember really. Like, it was kind of arbitrary. Like, it's difficult to tell which. I think there's some potential reverse causality among the two of them, where the extent to which I'm considering, have I got the best possible solution? Like, if my metacognitive awareness is there that I want to check widely, that's going to lead to increased decision time. But at the same time, if I'm spending more time, then perhaps that's also because I am spending more time checking, if that makes sense. So it's a bit hard to say which one is driving the other. Yeah. But if people have thoughts on that, I'm all ears.
Because time, yeah, very nice thought, very interesting. I was thinking about this distinction between fluid and crystallized intelligence, perhaps, you know, more expert performance of skills that you're highly trained in versus that you're having to kind of learn. Do you have a prediction or any data on, or about what, say if you had people that were highly trained on packing the max to a knapsack, you know, maybe they were really good, they're very good at you know, they have strategies and they're how that would be affected by stress. I was curious whether you think stress is more interruptive of performance of like skill procedures versus more fluid. Yeah,
that's a good question. I would expect that sort of prior experience would be a protective factor against the effects of stress, but I'm not super familiar with the literature on that.
It could almost be like stress is idealized for performing things that you already know how to do faster than usual, but makes you worse at learning new things.
Yeah, potentially. I see there's another couple of questions that I can pretty quickly answer. So one was was performance around chance in the third study, and I'll extend that to the second one as well. So the second and third were the optimization version. So there's 256 possible combinations that you could pick, and so performance was around 40% on average. So they're doing way better than chance across the board. And then, as there is a reward for correct answers, do I think the fact older people gave slightly more conservative, non-optimal answers where there was spare capacity could reflect risk aversion? I See, this is an interesting one, because if you were to sort of, as an economist, look at it rationally, there's no difference in underestimating weight or overestimating weight. They're both going to be just as wrong. But I've had this question come up before, so it's possible that the framing of things that people perceive, I would rather be underweight and I still have a chance of getting it right than going overweight and I know for sure that it's not right. So there might be some asymmetry in the types of errors people are willing to commit, and that's not something we've explored in much detail.
So I might have to draw to a close there. It's 12. I did have someone pull out of lunch ill, so there are some open spots for lunch if anyone would like to join us. We're going to DOC Osteria in Margot Street, so please let me know. We'll meet in the lobby at 12:15.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.